Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Nun Tes discusses the order of the avodos in the Beis Hamikdash. Most of the daf is devoted to the last few things that are performed. The Tamid, Shal Ben Arbayim, the afternoon Karban Tamid, the lighting of the Neros, the candles and the menorah, the burning of the Ketores, and the Karban Pesach when there is one. We'll see two braisas that discuss the order, and the Gemara will give the psukim to help us determine what the source of the correct order is. Then we'll get to another braisa which also discusses the order of things by the morning Tamid and by the afternoon Tamid, and it'll introduce another exception to the rule, that of Mechusar Kippurim. The Gemara will show what its source is and analyze how this exception works. So first of all, braisa which we are discussing refers to the four things: Tamid of the afternoon, Karban Pesach, Ketores, and Neros. The Gemara says this is the order. The Karban Tamid is after everything else that happens in the Beis Hamikdash, except for Karban Pesach, which is after the Karban Tamid, and after Karban Pesach comes Ketores, and then Neros. So the order on Erev Pesach is Tamid, Pesach, Ketores, Neros. What's the reason? So the Gemara says Pesach has to be after Tamid, because Pesach, the psukim that describe it, use the phrase Ben Harbayim and Ba'erev. One pasuk says, the Shakin Shemoisham Tizbach as a Pesach Ba'erev Kevoy HaShemesh. It says that you should bring it in the evening, and the other one says that it should be Ben Harbayim, as we have seen. So it says Erev, evening, and Ben Arbayim about the Karban Pesach, but about the Karban Tamid it only says Ben Arbayim. It doesn't say Erev, and therefore the Karban Pesach is after the Karban Tamid. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. But if that's your reasoning, then Karban Pesach should also be after Ketores and Neros, because Ketores and Neros also say Ben Ha'arbayim, and they do not say Erev. They're just like the Karban Tamid itself. Like it says, Uv'halois Arones HaNeros Ben Ha'arbayim Yaktirena. That's referring to both Neros and Ketores. Yaktirena Ketores. So why is Karban Pesach placed before Neros and Ketores, but after Tamid? So the Gemara says the reason is that there's a special pasuk that tells me that Neros is supposed to be later, and there's a hekesh, there's a linkage between Neros and Ketores. That linkage is because they're both mentioned together in the pasuk we just read. So those are both together. And in Neros it says that it should be me'erev ad boker. It should burn from the evening until the morning. That means you should set it up. It should be the last thing. It should run from evening until the morning. It's the only avodah that goes through the night. And therefore it has to be the last thing. It has to be after the Karban Pesach. The Gemara gives another source. The Gemara says, the pasuk says, Yarach osa arnovar me'erev ad boker. It should be burning from the evening until the night. Only it is done late at night. Only it is in the late evening, but the Karban Pesach should be before it. Now the Gemara says, interestingly, there's a braisa that says differently, and there's a braisa that says the kasha that we had asked. This braisa says the correct order is Tamid, then Tamid, then Ketores, then Neros, and then Pesach is last. Pesach goes after everything. What's the reason? Because it says Erev and Ben Arbayim. Ketores and Neros therefore go before it. The Gemara says, but what happened to the drasha which we just said in our other braisa? It says oisai. It says that this is the only thing that's supposed to be in the evening, that's supposed to be overnight. How could you have Pesach be after it? So the Gemara says, no, oisai is written by Neros, and that's to exclude Ketores, to tell you that Oso has to be later than Ketores. Oso goes overnight, Ketores doesn't go overnight. Why does it exclude Ketores and not Karban Pesach? Why is Karban Pesach allowed to be overnight? If the pasuk of Oso tells me that Neros has to be the only thing that's late at night, and that you're saying that's only excluding Ketoris, which is earlier, but Pesach could be later. Why is that? Why could Pesach be later? Why is it not excluded? The Gemara says because Ketoris and Neros are both inside the Heichal. They're both inside the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, when we say that Neros is the only thing that's late at night, that's excluding the other thing which is inside the building with it, which is Ketoris. But Pesach, that's different. That's not included in this exclusion, and therefore it could be after, because it's not inside the building. Now, the Gemara says, though, why would I need that? Where would I get the idea that Neros should be before Ketoris? So Gemara says, because the pasuk says, "B'halos Aaron es haneros ben arbayim yakti rena." That sounds like when Aaron is lighting the neros, you should burn ketoros. It sounds like the neros are already lit, and you're coming to burn ketoros afterwards. That would give us a reason to think neros should go before ketoros, and therefore we say that neros is also, it's the only thing that goes overnight, but ketoros doesn't go overnight because it's the last thing inside. So Gemara says, well then how do you understand that pasuk? It does say when Aaron is lighting the neros, you should burn the ketoris. So the Gemara says it doesn't mean that you should burn the ketoris then, it means the ketoris should be burning then. They should have already been lit, set on the fire for burning ketoris on the mizbeach beforehand. It should be already yakti red and should already be burning. At that time, Aaron should light the menorah. The lighting of the menorah then becomes the last thing that we do. Okay, now the Gemara is going to bring another brisa, and this brisa will introduce the order of the avodah surrounding the carbon talmud in the morning, as well as the exception, which we haven't discussed so far, to the carbonos that are last in the evening. And so the Brisa says as follows: the morning carbon and taida is the first thing. Nothing comes before that except the morning ketoris. That goes first, because when we describe that, we say baboker v'hekter olav Aaron ketoris samim baboker. It says the word baboker in the morning twice, as opposed to the carbon talmud word only says the word morning baboker one time. Now, as far as the afternoon avoda, the Talmud is the last thing, except for Ketoris and Neros that are after it, and a carbon Pesach, which is after, like we've seen the Bryce in the beginning of the Daf. And now we add another thing, and that's Mechoser Kippurim. Mechoser Kippurim is somebody who needs to bring a carbon in order to become Tahar. He's Tameh. This could refer to a Metzora or Yoledes, or a Zav or a Zava, things like that, which require a carbon to be brought in order for them to become a Tahar. After the carbon is brought, they then have to go to the mikveh again. So they are allowed to have their carbon brought. If they didn't manage to bring it earlier, they're allowed to have their carbon brought in order that they should be able to become tahar during the night. Now, why are we so concerned? So now we have a machlokes what the situation is that's so pressing to allow them to become tahar before the night. According to the Tanakam, this is only true on Erev Pesach. We want them to be tar to be able to eat the carbon Pesach that night, which is a mitzvah d'oraisa. According to Rabbi Shmuel ben Yoshua ben Breika, it's talking about any time that they brought a carbon shlamim and they want to be able to eat their shlamim in the evening. The halacha is in order for them to be able to eat kachim, they have to be tahar, and therefore any time they brought a shlamim, we will press and we will allow their kapara, their carbon that's machaper for them and takes their tumah off. We would allow them to bring that even after the ketores, after the neros, and after the carbon talmud. So now the Gemara therefore has this machlokes between Tanakam and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochanan ben Broika. The Gemara now asks, but hold on a second. The Torah told us nothing's supposed to go after the carbon talmud at all. We had a posuk on Daf Nun Ches that said that it should be hashleim, Victor leha es hashlamim, that the carbon taida should be the last thing. How are we violating that iser that the carbon taida is supposed to be the last thing? According to the Tanakama, that we're violating it in order to allow him to eat a carbon pesach. Missing a carbon pesach is an iser which carries kares. So that's more important than the law of not bringing anything after the carbon taida will push away the lav of carbon taida in order to bring this person's kapara carbon, in order to allow him to fulfill the mitzvah which carries kares of eating the carbon Pesach that night. But according to Yishmael ben Yochanan ben Breika, he has a mitzvah asay to eat from his carbon shlamim that he brought that day. Why should that mitzvah asay of eating from the carbon shlamim push away from the mitzvah of not bringing any other karbanas after the carbon tamid? So this is the Gemara's question, and the Gemara is going to have two answers, and then the Gemara will compare and contrast these two answers and ask kashas upon them. The two answers are as follows. It is Rav Chizda and Rav Papa. Rav Chizda says we're talking about where the carbon that has to be brought is a chatas ha'oif. It's a bird carbon. And the chatas ha'oif doesn't get burned on the mizbeach at all. Its blood gets pressed against the wall and then it's thrown into the trash heap, the karbanos trash heap, not a regular trash heap, chas v'shalom. And therefore there's nothing that has to be burned on the mizbeach. So there is no violation of the Torah's order that nothing should be burned after the carbon tamid, because this chatas ha'oif doesn't have to be burnt. But you are correct. Nothing would be allowed to be burned after the carbon tamid except for the carbon pesach, except for something to allow the carbon pesach, which is an iser kares. Says Rav Papa, is a different solution here. We're not going to be violating the Torah's iser, because what we're going to do is we're going to take the animal, even if it's a real animal carbon chatos, it's not just a bird. We're going to take the animal, we're going to put it up on the mizbeach, we're going to leave it there outside the fire the entire night. That way, we're not violating the issur of burning anything after the carbon tamid, and we're also not making a psul, because the halach is that anything which is on the top of the mizbech doesn't become pasul overnight. You're allowed to leave it overnight. It's not a problem. So that's what you're allowed to do. You bring it up there and you burn it. Okay? Those are the two answers. According to Rav Chizda, it's a bird. According to Rav Papa, you bring it up there and you leave it. Now the Gemara has a couple of kashas. First of all, number one, according to Rav Chizda, very nice that if it's a bird, but what are you going to do about the carbon asham? There is a mitzvah also has to bring a carbon asham for his purification. So that carbon asham is not a bird, it has to be an animal. So according to Rav Papa, it's good because you just leave that up there on the mizbeach, just like you said about the carbon chatas. But what are you going to do about the carbon asham? So Gemara says, Rav Chizda will tell you, we're talking about a situation where the carbon asham was brought earlier. You bring the carbon asham, you got to bring the carbon asham before the carbon tamid. There's no excuse for bringing that afterwards. We would not allow you to. If, however, you brought the carbon asham before, and then you brought the tamid, and you realize I forgot to bring the chatas ha'oif, then you're allowed to bring the chatas ha'oif in order to get your tahara. The Gemara says, very nice, but what about the carbon ayla? There's also a carbon ayla that goes along with a mitzara who is being purified. And don't tell me that you brought the carbon ayla already, because the chatas always has to be before the ayla. It can't, if you're bringing the carbon chatas now, after the carbon tamid, it can't be that you already brought your ayla beforehand, because the chatas always goes before the ayla. Anytime you have a chatas and an ayla coming together in a pair, the chatas has to go first. Now let's just prove that. How do you know that? Gemara says there is a pasuk which is describing the avoda of the karbanis for a shuas bitoy, somebody who makes an irrelevant, useless shavua. He has to bring a carbon chatas and a carbon ayla, and there it specifically says the carbon chatas first and carbon ayla second. Gemara says that's repetitive. Why do you have to tell me this one first and that one second? If this one's first, obviously that one's going to be second. That's to tell me in application to every other time you have a carbon chatas and ayla coming together as a pair, always the chatas goes first and the ayla goes second. Therefore, our question is, what are you going to do with the carbon ayla according to Rav Chizda? You only have an explanation for how you're allowed to bring the bird, the carbon chatas, but the carbon ola, you don't have an explanation for that. So Gemara says, Rava says that when we're talking about a mitzayra, there's an exception to the rule that chatas always has to go before the ola. By a mitzayra, the ola can go before the chatas. How do you know that? Because the pasuk describing the avodah of a mitzayra says, V'he'ela hakohen es ha'ola. It says, and the Kohen brought up the carbon ola. When it says he should bring it up, it doesn't use a future tense language, it uses a past tense language, which makes it sound like it was brought up already, to say that the ola was done beforehand, and that it was done first, and therefore the carbon ola actually goes before the chatos about a mitzvah. So therefore, Rav Chizda will say the explanation here is simple. We're talking about a mitzvah. He already brought his carbon ola. He already brought his carbon asham. Then he forgot to bring his carbon chatas ha'of, and the tamid was brought. He's allowed to bring his chatas ha'of afterwards in order that he should be able to eat from karbanos shlamim, because it won't violate the issur of burning other karbanos after the carbon tamid, because the chatas ha'of is not burned at all. Now, having concluded two kashas on Rav Chisda, the Gemara now has two kashas on Rav Papa. Question number one, we know that the Kohanim at night, after everything else has been completed, go up on the Mizbech and they place all the leftover imurim, anything that's lying around, they place it in the fire. According to Rav Papa, we're going to have a carbon there that's going to be sitting there waiting for the morning. You can't put it in the fire because you're not allowed to burn anything that was shechted after the carbon tamid. It's not allowed to go into the fire until the next morning after the next morning's carbon tamid. So while the Kohanim are adding in everything, they're adding in all the other things that were shechted before the carbon tamid. That's supposed to go into the fire. But this pile of imurim, of limbs, is going to be sitting there, and it's got to stay out of the fire, but they're just going to be cleaning up, and they're going to throw it into the fire. So you're bringing a tremendous takala, a tremendous disaster will happen. So Gemara says the Kohanim are his reason, Kohanim are very careful, and the Kohen who brings up this last carbon chatas animal that has to wait is not allowed to go into the fire until the next day. He will make sure to warn the other Kohanim they are not to put it in the fire. It has to stay on the side. It's not like the other limbs that are there. Okay, Gemara has another kasha. The whole point of bringing this carbon was that the person who brought it should have kapara. He should therefore take his tumah off and be allowed to eat a carbon shlamim. So the problem is that he won't be able to eat a carbon shlamim if you haven't burned it yet. According to Rav Papa, you're not burning it. The halacha is that until you burn it, the Kohanim don't have a right to eat it. Kohanim only have a right to eat the parts that they get when the parts that are burned are burned. And until the Kohanim eat it, there's no kapara for the owner, and therefore their tumah stays on. They're still mechazer kippurim. Just the Gemara brings brises to support this. Gemara says, and right afterwards it says, so you see that the burning has to come before Aaron gets to eat the chaz of a shilk, the parts that Kohanim eat. So that's that order. And you only get kapara after the Kohanim eat it, like it says, that the eating of the Kohanim goes together with the kapara. So again, the problem is that there won't be kapara. So the Gemara says that's usually true. Usually there's no kapara for the owners until the Kohanim have eaten it, and the Kohanim can't eat it until it's burned. What, however, happens if there is some disaster that happens to the parts that are supposed to be burned? What happens if the parts that are supposed to be burned are lost or become tamei? As we have seen in our introduction to the psum of karbanos, that doesn't ruin the carbon. You can continue bringing the rest of the carbon afterwards, not a problem. Now, what about the rule that Kohanim don't get their chaz of ashok, the part that they're supposed to eat? If it gets ruined and you can't burn it, then they do get it. So this is also just like that. Here's also a situation where you can't burn it. You're not allowed to burn it because you'll be in violation of the Torah's isser to put anything in the fire after the carbon tamid. The carbon tamid has to be the last thing. Therefore, you can't burn it. You can't burn it. It's just like if it got lost or destroyed, where the Kohanim are allowed to eat the chaz of ashok, even though the parts that are burned aren't burned yet, and therefore the owner will get his kapara at that time. Not a problem. Gemara now brings two sets of contradictory psukim and their resolutions, which are related subject to this. The first is of Kahana, who says you have a contradiction between one pasuk which has layon chayev chagi ad boiker. You can't leave karbanos over until the morning. That means you could leave them until just before the morning. That means you could bring them up at any time during the night, as long as they're not still off the mizbeach when the sun rises. You're okay. But how could you bring them up during the night? Don't we know that the carbon tamid has to be the last thing put on the fire? Gemara says it just means that it has to be the last thing that you're getting ready for the fire. Be the last thing that you're shechting. If you have something which you shechted before the carbon tamid, you don't have to actually put it on the fire before the carbon tamid. It has to be ready for the fire before the carbon tamid. You could actually put it up after the carbon tamid. Okay, second contradiction was asked by Rav Safra to Rav. The pasuk says that you should not leave the carbon Pesach over until the morning. You only allow not leave it over till the morning. That means you could put it up on the mizbech the entire night. But how could you do that? The carbon Pesach is a weekday carbon. It's brought on Erev Pesach. And we have another pasuk that says that you are allowed to only put on the fire a carbon of that Shabbos or Yom Tov. You can't take a weekday carbon and put it on the fire on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. So how could you take that carbon Pesach, which is a weekday carbon, and put it on the fire all night, which is Yom Tov? So Gemara says this is talking about where Pesach was a Shabbos. That's where you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to put a Shabbos carbon on the fire on Yom Tov. That's not a problem. Gemara says, what? You're going to minimize the range of psukim in order to fit your idea? How you have a right to say, oh, the pasuk is talking about a situation? That's what we do with Mishnahs and Brises, not what we do with psukim. So Gemara says, I'm not minimizing the pasuk. The pasuk is obviously talking about it, because otherwise you have a contradictory psukim, like you asked, and therefore it has to fit together, and it has to be the...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.